Hello, welcome to the fifth and final segment of my discussion of virtue ethics. In this segment, I want to talk about some of the problems or weaknesses of virtue ethics, and probably one of them may have occurred to you already. Is this not a form of ethical relativism? Since our virtues relative to communities, and therefore we cannot, what's good for me in my community is not what's good for you in your community, or what are we supposed to say here? Do the different communities offer different perspectives on what it is for human beings to flourish, and is this important? Or alternatively, are they just always all interpretations of how to go about social cooperation in communities that face particular obstacles? Maybe there's more than one way to create a cooperating community. Now, some ways may be better than others, and as long as you can say, well, yes, that's a virtue in your community, but that way of doing things is not as good as this way of doing things, we haven't gone to a full ethical relativism, though we have said, well, yes, this is how you should behave in that community. And we can generally, many of us are flexible enough to take up different ways of behaving in different communities if that's necessary. But what's particularly important is that these may all be ways of generating social cooperation, getting the rewards of social cooperation, and they may all, and the criticism may have to be at the level of which sort of community is more fair than the others, or which sort of community is evil, or whatever, which sort of community is too warlike to fit into a larger community. Another problem with this is that since communities educate people in the virtues that they have, and those are often taught when they're children, it may not make for, this way of thinking may not make for critical people who have the intellectual resources to criticize their own shared understandings within those communities. And that's why it's important, I guess, for people to be exposed to other communities, to see how it's done in other places, and then bring that back and reform your community. It might not be possible to reform your community if you're never exposed to anything else but your community. But if you can step outside, if you can go to university and then come back or something, if you can go traveling around the world and come back, then you maybe can acquire the resources to reform your community if it's necessary. And certainly some communities need reforming. I mean, there certainly are what we might call questionable community standards if we look in history. I mean, we revel maybe in the stories of bravery in Homeric Greece and the battles outside the walls of Troy, but we're not really approve of the behavior of Achilles or whatever. They're not things that's a questionable way to go about organizing social cooperation, basically plundering other people. Even societies that people admire. Now, philosophers are prone to admire the Athens of Plato and Aristotle, because it first of all invented democracy, and second of all invented philosophy. This was a wonderfully flourishing little culture for some people, and there was a real problem with ancient Athens in that yes, it was a democracy, but only for citizens of Athens, male citizens of Athens, and it excluded all the women in Athens, and it also excluded all the slaves in Athens. Athens was a slave-owning democracy, and it's not the sort of community that should go uncriticized. So the virtues that were necessary to live in Athens, or the character traits were there, included, yes, good ones like standing up for yourself in public debate, but they also included a willingness to oppress your slaves, and that's hardly something that we would, from our perspective, approve of. This approach also could be accused of vagueness. I said it involved wisdom, and wisdom involved working out what were the virtues and how they should fit between the different vices that were on either side of them. But this, you could also say, that's not just wisdom, that's vagueness. And other approaches give more guidance. I mean, economic utilitarianism says to do a cost-benefit analysis, and at the end of your cost-benefit analysis, you'll have a precise answer as to what you should do. But that's not really, the other theories, though they have the appearance of being well worked out, they are often vague in their implementation. How do you measure willingness to pay? Well, yes, you've got this market price, but that's not often usually the person's reservation price. How are we going to measure how much they would pay for the third item, the third piece of that good that they acquire, their third widget? How are we going to measure willingness to pay for things like the absence of environmental pollution, where that's not something that has a market price? So when you look at other ethical approaches, they often are not actually as precise as they appear to be. They want to be precise, but they're not. Again, those theories of distributive justice, how do you apply them? And it requires a certain amount of moral perception and moral acumen to be able to apply, say, a theory of justice to a particular situation. And that, of course, is what you're being asked to do in these cases. In the cases in this course, you're being asked to take things that seem to philosophers to be fairly precise, and then when you go to apply them, you find, well, it's not as easy as I thought. It is a skill, and it's more like a virtue to be able to apply theories of ethical reasoning to situations. Another problem that people raise about this is that this virtue ethic seems in a way to be a form of narcissism, right? You're trying to achieve personal virtue in order to flourish, not because personal virtue will allow you to treat other people better, but because that makes you better, makes you a better person. So you can regard that as a form of narcissism, as a form of working in your own self-interest, as a form of thinking only from your own point of view. But don't forget, those virtues are virtues that are for the good of other people. They help people to cooperate in wider societies, and by cooperating, people are safer. They're not bopping each other on the head and stealing things, but they're also are able to do things like divide the labor, specialize and divide up the labor, and therefore achieve things that they couldn't achieve alone. And yes, the focus is on the person acquiring the virtue, but on the other hand, the virtue that they are acquiring is not just in their own self-interest in a narrow sense. It's in their enlightened self-interest, or in the interest of the society as a whole. Finally, there is a trouble with people belonging to more than one community. And if they belong to more than one community, then they have trouble balancing the demands of the different virtues. For example, and this is one that's familiar to many people, is that the virtues that are required at work are different from the virtues that are required at home. At home, you have to behave, you have to show a certain loving kindness, a certain generosity, and a certain just compassion, etc., for people in your family and how that works. And you don't demand justice. You don't always demand fairness. You treat people in a different way than you perhaps treat them at work. And the same person who is a virtuous business person may not be a virtuous father, may not be a good father, and vice versa. You can have lots of people who are good parents, say, at home, or good spouses who are not necessarily good people at work. And this is a problem as to saying if you're members of different communities, the different communities have different virtues are required to flourish in different communities, then what do you do? It's a similar problem that we had when we talked about ethical relativism. So you have to figure out some way, and perhaps this is where wisdom comes in again. You have to balance the virtues of the workplace and of the domestic scene. So finally, last question. Which of the following is not, it's one of those backwards questions again, a potential weakness for, or a problem for, virtue ethics. So we're looking for things that are not weaknesses, i.e. strengths. Okay, so think for a second, and I'll tell you what I think in a moment. Okay, let's go through them here. Which of the following is not a potential weakness of virtue ethics? Well, let's start at the top here. It can be in the service of cooperation in immoral or unjust communities. Well, yes, you can. If you are in an unjust community and you develop the virtues that enable you to flourish there, you may not really flourish on the broader sense. So that is a potential weakness. We're looking for things that are not a potential weakness. It offers little support for members who wish to think critically about the standards of their communities. Well, I mentioned that as a problem because you're brought up in the standards of your community, and until you can get outside and help get some distance and some ability to reflect backwards on your community, it's difficult to see outside of that. Virtue ethics enables low-cost solutions to some dilemmas of cooperation. Well, yes, that's the sort of, we've talked about that earlier, right? When we talked about the prisoner's dilemma and the costs of enforcement, and how you could have certain character traits that would help you achieve cooperation if everybody had them. Then this is the sort of thing that is actually a strength of virtue ethics. It's not a weakness. And it appears to accept ethical relativism in its acceptance of community standards. Well, that is, as we said, a potential problem for virtue ethics. So I would give you an answer C for that one. All right, thank you for your interest in this, and I will see you in the 8th set of lectures on feminism next week.